Dr. Vincent Hayes stood at the pinnacle of his profession, and everyone in the city knew his name. At 42 years old, he had built a reputation as one of the most brilliant cardiovascular surgeons in the country. His private practice in Manhattan catered to celebrities and politicians and wealthy business magnates who trusted him with their lives. Awards lined his office walls, and medical journals regularly published his groundbreaking research. The media loved him, and he appeared on morning talk shows discussing health and wellness with his charming smile that made everyone feel safe. His charitable foundation provided free heart surgeries to underprivileged children, and the newspapers called him a humanitarian. He lived in a luxurious Upper East Side townhouse that spoke of his success, and his life seemed absolutely perfect from every angle. Detective Lauren Bishop had heard of Dr. Hayes long before she ever met him, because everyone had. His face was on billboards, and his name was mentioned in conversations about excellence in medicine. But Lauren was not thinking about any of that as she stood outside the doctor's townhouse on a cold October morning. She was there because of a missing person case that had gone cold 6 months ago. A young nurse named Sophie Grant had vanished without a trace, and the only connection anyone could find was that she had briefly worked at Dr. Hayes' clinic before her disappearance. The case had haunted Lauren for months because Sophie had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle, and her bank accounts remained untouched, and her family had heard nothing from her. It was as if she had never existed. Beside Lauren sat her partner Duke, who was not human but a German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. The dog had been with her for 3 years, and in that time they had cracked dozens of cases together. Duke was not just any police dog because he had an uncanny ability to detect things other dogs missed. He had a sixth sense that had earned him commendations from the department and respect from every officer who worked with him. Lauren had learned to trust Duke's instincts completely because the dog had never been wrong. When Duke sensed something, it meant there was something to find. As they approached the pristine white steps of the townhouse, Duke suddenly stopped. His ears perked forward and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Lauren felt her pulse quicken because she knew what that meant. Duke had detected something, and his body language told her it was important. The dog's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and then the ground, and then the ornate iron railing leading up to the front door. Something had caught his attention, and it was something invisible to human senses. Lauren knelt beside her partner and whispered softly, asking him what he had found, but Duke just continued to sniff and growl low in his throat. The morning air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across the sidewalk as Lauren studied the townhouse. Everything about it screamed wealth and perfection. The windows gleamed, and the facade was immaculate, and even the small garden area was perfectly manicured. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Duke was telling her otherwise. She had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving, and that evil often wore the mask of respectability. Duke did not care about appearances because his nose told him the truth that human eyes could not see. Lauren took a deep breath and walked up the steps with Duke close at her heels. She pressed the doorbell and heard its melodious chime echo inside the house. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open. Dr. Vincent Hayes stood there wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and designer jeans. He looked more like a movie star than a surgeon on his day off. His smile was warm and welcoming, and his blue eyes sparkled with apparent friendliness. Everything about him projected confidence and charm. He greeted Lauren warmly and said he had been expecting her. He mentioned Sophie's name with what seemed like genuine sadness and invited Lauren and Duke inside. The detective studied his face carefully as she entered, because she had interviewed enough criminals to know that some people were very good at lying. The townhouse interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Modern art hung on the walls, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Everything was perfect and pristine and organized. Too perfect, Lauren thought to herself. They walked through the foyer into a spacious living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the morning light. Dr. Hayes offered coffee or tea, but Lauren declined politely. She wanted to keep this professional and focused. As they settled into the seating area, Duke refused to sit. The dog remained standing, and his attention was fixed on a hallway that led toward the back of the house. His nostrils flared repeatedly, and Lauren could see that he was processing scents that told him a story she could not yet read. Dr. Hayes noticed Duke's behavior and commented on what a beautiful dog he was. Lauren thanked him and explained that Duke was her partner and the best detective in the department. The doctor's smile seemed to tighten just slightly, and Lauren caught it. It was just a fraction of a second, but she had been trained to notice these things. She filed the observation away in her mind. For the next 20 minutes, Lauren asked standard questions about Sophie Grant's employment at the clinic. She asked about Sophie's duties and whether Dr. Hayes had noticed anything unusual about her behavior before she disappeared. His answers were polite and helpful and completely unrevealing. He expressed appropriate concern and sadness about the missing woman. He said Sophie had been a good nurse and that her disappearance was tragic. He claimed to have told the previous investigators everything he knew and that he wished he could be more helpful. But Duke never relaxed during the entire conversation. The dog's focus remained locked on that hallway, and twice he whined softly. Lauren knew that sound well because it meant Duke wanted to investigate something. She could see the tension in his body and the way his eyes kept darting toward the back of the house. Whatever Duke was sensing, it was strong enough to hold his complete attention. Lauren decided to test something, and she asked Dr. Hayes if Duke could take a walk around the house. She explained that sometimes the dog picked up scents that helped eliminate possibilities in investigations. The doctor paused, and the pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but Lauren caught it. He then explained that he was allergic to pet dander and had taken medication that day. Because he knew she was bringing Duke, he said if the dog went through the whole house, he would be sneezing for days. It was a reasonable excuse, and Lauren had no grounds to push further. But Duke's behavior told her everything she needed to know, and something was wrong in this house. Dr. Hayes returned from his phone call and noticed Lauren standing by the closet door with Duke sitting in front of it. His expression changed for just a moment before the pleasant mask returned to his face. He explained quickly that it was just storage and that inside were cleaning supplies and old furniture and nothing interesting. His voice was casual, but Lauren detected something underneath the words. A tension, perhaps, or a hint of anxiety that he was trying to conceal. Lauren asked if she could take a look inside and watched his reaction carefully. Again, there was that barely perceptible hesitation before he responded. He said the closet was quite cluttered and embarrassing, really, because he kept meaning to organize it, but never found the time. He laughed as if the whole thing was silly and unimportant. But Duke continued to sit there whining softly and pawing at the bottom of the door. The dog was absolutely certain about what he sensed. Lauren had no warrant for a full search and no probable cause to insist on opening the closet. She was there on a voluntary interview basis, and Dr. Hayes had the right to refuse. She could see in his eyes that he knew this. He was polite but firm about keeping the closet closed. Lauren made a mental note and decided not to push the issue at that moment. Sometimes in detective work you had to be patient and wait for the right opportunity. But Duke's certainty told her everything she needed to know. Something important was behind that door, and Dr. Hayes did not want her to see it. Over the following days, Lauren could not stop thinking about that closet. She lay awake at night wondering what could be inside that would make Duke react so strongly. The dog had sensed something through the door, and whatever it was had triggered his instincts in a powerful way. Lauren knew she needed more evidence to get a warrant that would allow her to search the house thoroughly. She needed something concrete that would convince a judge. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. A woman named Katie Sullivan walked into the police station and asked to speak with the detective handling the Sophie Grant case. Lauren sat down with Katie in an interview room and listened as the woman told her story. Katie had worked with Dr. Hayes 2 years earlier at his private clinic. She had been a nurse there for about 8 months before moving to another position. During her time at the clinic, she had noticed discrepancies in patient medication records. The numbers did not always add up correctly, and sometimes medications were listed as administered when Katie had no memory of giving them. When Katie had questioned these discrepancies, Dr. Hayes had been dismissive. He had attributed the errors to administrative mistakes and had told Katie not to worry about it. He had been charming and reassuring and had made her feel like she was being overly concerned about minor paperwork issues. Katie had let it go at the time because Dr. Hayes was her boss, and he seemed so confident and trustworthy. But Sophie Grant's disappearance had been weighing on her conscience for months. Katie explained that she had known Sophie slightly, because they had both worked in the same medical community. After Sophie disappeared, Katie had remembered something important. Sophie had mentioned to her once that she had also noticed irregularities in patient files at Dr. Hayes' clinic. Sophie had seemed concerned about it and had said she was going to look into it more carefully. That conversation had happened just a few weeks before Sophie vanished. Lauren felt her heart rate increase as Katie spoke. This was the connection she had been looking for. Two nurses who both worked for Dr. Hayes and both noticed medication discrepancies, and one of them had disappeared. It could not be a coincidence. Katie explained that she had been afraid to come forward earlier because she did not want to believe that Dr. Hayes could be involved in anything criminal. He was so respected and admired that it seemed impossible. But her guilt about staying silent had finally become too much to bear. Armed with this new information, Lauren went to her captain and requested permission to launch a full investigation into Dr. Hayes' medical practice. She wanted to audit his patient records and medication orders going back several years. The captain was hesitant because Dr. Hayes was a prominent figure, and accusing him of wrongdoing would create significant publicity. But Lauren presented the evidence carefully and explained Duke's reactions, and the captain finally agreed. The audit took 3 weeks to complete. Forensic accountants and medical auditors went through 6 years of records from Dr. Hayes' private practice. What they discovered was subtle but damning. Over the course of those 6 years, Dr. Hayes had been systematically ordering controlled substances, far in excess of what his patient load required. The quantities were small enough not to trigger automatic flags in the system. Each individual order seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation. But when examined over time, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was diverting prescription medications, and the only person with access to order them was Dr. Hayes himself. The auditors calculated that thousands of pills had gone missing over the years. Painkillers and sedatives and other controlled substances that should have been administered to patients but had somehow disappeared. The street value of the missing drugs exceeded $2 million. Lauren now had probable cause for a search warrant, but she still had questions. Where were the drugs going, and what had happened to Sophie Grant? The medication theft was serious, but it did not explain the nurse's disappearance. There had to be more to the story. Lauren suspected that Sophie had discovered the theft and that Dr. Hayes had done something to silence her. But she needed proof, and she needed to find Sophie if the woman was still alive. Lauren met with the district attorney to discuss the case. They agreed to obtain search warrants for both the townhouse and the storage unit in Queens. They would execute both searches simultaneously to prevent Dr. Hayes from destroying evidence. The district attorney warned Lauren that they needed to find something concrete, because Dr. Hayes would hire the best lawyers money could buy. A medication discrepancy alone might not be enough to convict him if he claimed administrative errors. The night before the searches, Lauren sat in her apartment with Duke lying at her feet. She went over the case in her mind and tried to anticipate what they might find. The dog had been right all along and had sensed something wrong from the very first visit to the townhouse. Lauren reached down and scratched Duke behind the ears. She told him that tomorrow they would find out what he had been trying to tell her. Duke looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and Lauren felt certain they were close to uncovering the truth. The morning of the search arrived cold and gray, with clouds hanging low over the city. Lauren met her team outside the townhouse at 7 in the morning. There were 6 officers plus Greg Murphy, the forensic specialist, and Duke, of course. Everyone wore vests and carried their weapons because they did not know what they might encounter. Dr. Hayes might be a respected surgeon, but cornered criminals could be dangerous regardless of their background. When they knocked on the door, Dr. Hayes answered, already dressed in expensive casual clothes. Standing beside him was his attorney, Patricia Cole, who was a sharp-eyed woman with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she did not intimidate easily. Patricia immediately made it clear that she would be documenting everything that happened during the search. She stated that her client was cooperating fully with law enforcement, but that they expected the search to be conducted professionally. Any damage to the property would be documented for compensation. Lauren ignored the posturing and headed straight for the closet door with Duke. The dog was already pulling at his leash and whining with excitement. Duke knew they were finally going to investigate what he had been sensing all along. An officer used a crowbar to force open the locked closet door. The lock broke easily and the door swung open to reveal exactly what Dr. Hayes had described. Cleaning supplies and a vacuum cleaner and stacks of old furniture were crammed into the small space. It looked completely ordinary, but Duke was not satisfied. The dog pushed past the vacuum cleaner and began pawing frantically at the back wall of the closet. Lauren squeezed into the cramped space and examined the wall closely. At first it looked like standard wood paneling that matched the rest of the house. But as she studied it more carefully, she noticed something odd. The wood paneling looked slightly different from the surrounding walls. The color was almost the same, but not quite, and there was a thin gap along one edge that did not seem right. Lauren called for Greg to come examine the wall. The forensic specialist pulled out his tools and began checking the paneling carefully. He ran his fingers along the edges and tapped on the wood, listening to the sound. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for: a hidden latch disguised as a nail head. When Greg pressed it, there was a soft click and a section of the wall swung inward like a door. Behind it was darkness and a narrow staircase leading down into what appeared to be a basement. Dr. Hayes went pale when the hidden door opened. Patricia Cole immediately demanded that the search be stopped. She claimed loudly that the warrant did not cover secret rooms and that anything found beyond that door would be inadmissible in court. But Lauren knew the law. The warrant covered the entire property, and this room was part of that property. The fact that it was hidden did not matter legally. Patricia continued to object, but Lauren ignored her and turned on her flashlight. With weapons drawn and Duke leading the way, Lauren descended the narrow stairs. The steps were steep and the air grew cooler as they went down. The staircase opened into a room that had been completely hidden from the rest of the house. Lauren's flashlight beam swept across the space, and what she saw made her stomach tighten. This was not a normal basement. The room had been converted into some kind of laboratory. The walls were painted white and the floor was covered in linoleum tile. Stainless steel tables held chemical processing equipment, including beakers and burners and filtration systems. Shelves lined one wall, and they were filled with bottles of prescription medications. Lauren recognized the names on the labels: painkillers and sedatives and other controlled substances. There were enough pills to stock a pharmacy. Everything was organized and labeled with the same meticulous care that Dr. Hayes apparently applied to all aspects of his life. On a desk in the corner sat several ledgers. Lauren opened one and began reading. The pages contained detailed records documenting transactions over the past 6 years. Names and dates and amounts were listed in neat columns. Some entries noted the types of medications sold and the prices received. Other entries referenced something called product enhancement, which Lauren guessed meant the doctor had been using the laboratory equipment to modify or synthesize stronger versions of the prescription drugs. The street value of the operation had to be enormous, but the most disturbing items in the room were on a bulletin board hanging above the desk. Dozens of photographs were pinned there showing people Lauren did not recognize. Some appeared to be surveillance photos taken without the subject's knowledge. Others looked like identification photos. In one corner of the bulletin board, Lauren found a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was a picture of Sophie Grant. The young nurse was tied to a chair with duct tape over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear and her face was pale. The photograph had been taken in this very room, and Lauren could see the same white walls and stainless steel table in the background. Lauren's hands shook slightly as she unpinned the photograph. She called for Greg to come down and document everything. The other officers spread out through the room, cataloging evidence and taking photographs. Duke sniffed every corner of the space, and his behavior confirmed what Lauren already knew. This was what the dog had been sensing all along: the scent of fear and chemicals and hidden evil that had lingered in the house above. Duke had known from the very first visit that something terrible had happened here. Patricia Cole came down the stairs with Dr. Hayes following reluctantly behind her. The attorney's face was grim as she surveyed the hidden laboratory. She knew immediately that this changed everything. There was no way to explain away this evidence. Dr. Hayes stood silently and looked at the room that had been his secret for 6 years. His expression was blank, as if he had retreated somewhere inside himself. Lauren held up the photograph of Sophie Grant and asked Dr. Hayes where the nurse was. She demanded to know what he had done to her. The doctor said nothing, and Patricia put her hand on his arm, advising him not to speak. But Lauren could see guilt written clearly on his face. Whatever had happened to Sophie Grant, this man knew the answer. The search of the storage unit in Queens yielded more evidence. The boxes that had seemed innocent before now took on new meaning. The medical supplies had been stockpiled for the illegal operation. The notebooks contained not just surgical observations, but also notes about drug processing techniques and customer preferences. Everything fit together into a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated for years right under everyone's noses. Lauren and her team spent the entire day collecting evidence and documenting the crime scene. By evening, they had enough to charge Dr. Hayes with multiple felonies, including drug trafficking and conspiracy. But the question of what happened to Sophie Grant remained unanswered, and that bothered Lauren more than anything else. The photograph proved Sophie had been held in that basement room, but where was she now? Dr. Vincent Hayes sat in the interrogation room at the police station, and he no longer looked like the confident television personality who charmed audiences with medical advice. He looked like a trapped man watching his carefully constructed life unravel piece by piece. Patricia Cole sat beside him, and her expression was grim because she knew the evidence against her client was overwhelming. The hidden laboratory and the ledgers and the photograph of Sophie Grant were impossible to explain away. Still, she advised her client to remain silent and let the lawyers handle everything. But Lauren had spent hours reviewing all the evidence from the hidden room, and she knew there was more to discover. The operation had been remarkably sophisticated. Dr. Hayes had used his medical license to acquire prescription medications legally. He ordered quantities that were just small enough not to trigger automatic monitoring systems. Then he either diverted the medications directly to street dealers or used his basement laboratory to synthesize more potent compounds. The chemical equipment suggested he had been enhancing the drugs to make them more addictive and more profitable. The ledgers revealed a network of buyers throughout the city. Many of the drugs had ended up in the hands of distributors who sold them to addicts on street corners. Others went to wealthy clients who wanted prescription painkillers without the scrutiny of their own doctors. Dr. Hayes had built a customer base that ranged from desperate addicts to privileged socialites. He had been feeding the city's drug problem while maintaining his public image as a humanitarian. The hypocrisy was staggering, but what Lauren focused on now was the photograph of Sophie Grant. She slid it across the table toward Dr. Hayes and demanded to know where the nurse was. She told him that they had him on drug trafficking charges that would put him away for decades, but if he had hurt Sophie or if she was dead, he was looking at life without parole. She explained that talking now and cooperating might make the prosecutor consider a deal. It was his only chance to help himself. Dr. Hayes stared at the photograph and said nothing. Patricia leaned close to her client and whispered urgently in his ear. Lauren could not hear what the attorney was saying, but she could guess. Patricia was probably telling him to stay quiet and let the legal process unfold. But Lauren could see something in Dr. Hayes' eyes that suggested he wanted to talk. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was simply exhaustion from carrying his secrets for so long. After several minutes of whispered conversation with his attorney, Dr. Hayes finally spoke. His voice was quiet, and he did not look at Lauren when he talked. He said that Sophie had found out about the medication discrepancies. She had been too smart and too thorough. She had noticed the numbers did not add up, and she had started asking questions. At first, Dr. Hayes had tried to deflect her concerns, just as he had done with Katie Sullivan. He had told Sophie the discrepancies were administrative errors and nothing to worry about. But Sophie had not been satisfied with that answer. The nurse had kept digging, and eventually she had found evidence of the missing medications. She had confronted Dr. Hayes in his office one evening after the clinic had closed. She had brought documentation showing the pattern of diverted drugs over several months. She had told him she was going to report him to the authorities. Dr. Hayes said he had panicked in that moment. 6 years of work and millions of dollars were about to be destroyed by one determined nurse. He could not let that happen. Lauren asked what he had done, and her voice was cold. Dr. Hayes explained that he had convinced Sophie to come to his townhouse to discuss the situation privately. He had told her they could work something out and that going to the authorities would ruin both of their careers. Sophie had been hesitant, but she had agreed to hear him out. That had been her fatal mistake. When Sophie arrived at the townhouse, Dr. Hayes had drugged her coffee. He had used sedatives from his own supply, and within minutes Sophie had lost consciousness. He had carried her down to the hidden basement room and restrained her there. Dr. Hayes claimed he had not planned to hurt her. He insisted he just needed time to figure out what to do. He had kept her sedated and tied to a chair while he tried to think of a solution. Lauren felt anger rising in her chest as she listened. She asked how long he had kept Sophie prisoner in that basement. Dr. Hayes said it had been 3 days. 3 days during which Sophie's family had been frantic with worry. 3 days during which the young woman had been terrified and helpless. Dr. Hayes said he had given her sedatives to keep her calm. He made it sound almost compassionate, as if he had been doing her a favor. He insisted again that he had not been trying to hurt her, and that he just needed time to think. Lauren demanded to know what happened after 3 days. Dr. Hayes looked up, and for the first time, Lauren saw genuine emotion in his eyes. It looked like fear mixed with something else. He explained that on the third night, Sophie had somehow picked the lock on her restraints. He did not know how she had done it. Maybe she had found a piece of wire, or maybe she had worked at the locks until they gave way. Dr. Hayes said he had fallen asleep in the room upstairs, and when he went down to check on her, the next morning she was gone. The hidden door to the basement had been left slightly open, and Sophie had escaped into the night. Dr. Hayes said he had been terrified. He had expected her to go straight to the police and turn him in. He had waited for the authorities to show up at his door. But hours passed, and then days, and then weeks, and nothing happened. Sophie never came forward. She never reported what had happened to her. Dr. Hayes said he had spent the last 6 months in a state of constant anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Lauren asked if he had tried to find Sophie after she escaped. Dr. Hayes shook his head and said he had been too afraid. He had hoped she would simply disappear and never tell anyone what he had done. He had convinced himself that maybe Sophie was too traumatized or too afraid to report him. Or maybe she had reasons of her own for not wanting to involve the police. Dr. Hayes had been living with the uncertainty for half a year. Patricia Cole interrupted and said her client had provided enough information. She insisted that Dr. Hayes had cooperated fully and that this should be taken into account during sentencing. Lauren ignored the attorney and asked Dr. Hayes if he had any idea where Sophie might have gone. The doctor said he did not know. Sophie could be anywhere. She had fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. Lauren ended the interrogation and left the room. She needed to find Sophie Grant, and the clock was ticking. Finding Sophie Grant became Lauren's top priority. The young woman had been missing for 6 months, and if Dr. Hayes was telling the truth, she was alive somewhere. But where would someone go after escaping such a traumatic experience? Lauren thought about it from Sophie's perspective. The woman had been kidnapped and drugged and held prisoner by someone she had trusted. She had managed to escape but was probably terrified that Dr. Hayes would find her and silence her permanently. Going to the police might have seemed too risky if she believed the doctor had connections or influence. Lauren put out alerts to police departments across the country with Sophie's photograph and description. She contacted the FBI and asked them to check their databases for any matches to Sophie's name or social security number. She reached out to homeless shelters and women's crisis centers, thinking Sophie might have sought help from those kinds of organizations. But days passed with no leads. It was as if Sophie had vanished into thin air just as effectively as when she had first disappeared. Duke seemed to sense Lauren's frustration. The dog stayed close to her during those difficult days and provided silent companionship. They had solved the case of Dr. Hayes' criminal operation, but Lauren felt like the job was not finished until Sophie was found safe. The photograph of the terrified nurse tied to a chair haunted Lauren's dreams. She needed to know that Sophie had survived and was okay. The break came from an unexpected source. A police officer in a small town in Pennsylvania named Officer Carl Brooks called Lauren's cell phone one evening. He explained that he had seen the alert about Sophie Grant and thought he might have information. Carl said there was a woman working at a diner in his town who matched Sophie's description. The woman called herself Jane Miller and claimed to be from Ohio, but Carl had noticed she seemed nervous whenever police officers came into the diner. Something about her behavior had made him pay attention. Lauren felt her heart rate increase. She asked Carl to describe the woman in detail, and everything matched Sophie. Same height and same build and same distinctive birthmark on her left arm that had been noted in Sophie's missing person file. Lauren told Carl not to approach the woman but to keep her location under surveillance. She said she would be there first thing in the morning. Lauren drove to Pennsylvania before dawn with Duke in the passenger seat. The small town was about 3 hours from the city and was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Main Street had a few shops and a post office and the diner where the woman worked. Lauren met Officer Carl at the police station and he briefed her on what he had observed. The woman calling herself Jane Miller had been working at the diner for about 5 months. She rented a small room above the hardware store and kept to herself. She had no car and no bank account and seemed to be living on cash from her waitressing job. Carl said the woman never talked about her past and seemed jumpy around strangers. The diner owner liked her because she was a hard worker, but had noticed the same nervousness that Carl observed. It was clear the woman was running from something or someone. Carl had checked the name Jane Miller but found no records matching someone of her age and description. It was obviously a fake identity. Lauren asked Carl to take her to the diner. They arrived just as the morning shift was starting. Through the window, Lauren could see a woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was taking orders from customers and pouring coffee. Even from a distance, Lauren recognized her from the photographs in Sophie's file. It was definitely Sophie Grant. Lauren entered the diner alone because she did not want to overwhelm Sophie with multiple police officers. Duke stayed outside with Carl. The diner was warm and smelled of bacon and fresh coffee. A few locals sat at the counter reading newspapers. Sophie was behind the counter and looked up when Lauren entered. For a moment their eyes met and Lauren saw recognition flash across Sophie's face. The woman knew immediately why Lauren was there. Sophie's face went pale and her hands started shaking. She dropped the coffee pot she had been holding and it shattered on the floor. The other customers looked up in surprise. Sophie backed away from the counter and Lauren could see panic in her eyes. The young woman looked like she was about to run. Lauren held up her hands in a calming gesture and spoke softly. She told Sophie that she was safe and that Dr. Hayes was in custody. She said he could never hurt Sophie again. But Sophie was not listening. The trauma of the past 6 months had left her unable to trust anyone, especially police officers, who might be connected to Dr. Hayes somehow. Sophie turned and ran toward the back of the diner. Lauren followed quickly and found Sophie huddled in the storage room among boxes of supplies. The young woman was crying and shaking and looked terrified. She kept saying she could not go back and that he would find her, and that she just wanted to be left alone. Lauren sat down on the floor near Sophie but did not try to touch her. She spoke in a calm, quiet voice. She explained that Dr. Hayes was in jail and that his hidden laboratory had been discovered. She told Sophie about the evidence they had found and about the charges he was facing. She said that Dr. Hayes had admitted to kidnapping Sophie and that he was going to prison for a very long time. Sophie needed to hear all of this before she could begin to believe she was truly safe. Slowly, Sophie's breathing began to calm. She looked at Lauren with red eyes and asked if it was really true. Was Dr. Hayes really in custody? Lauren showed her phone and pulled up a news article about the arrest. The headline read, "Famous Surgeon Arrested in Drug Trafficking Ring." Sophie read the article and tears streamed down her face. But these were different tears. These were tears of relief. Sophie told Lauren her story. After escaping from the basement, she had been too terrified to go to the police. She had believed that Dr. Hayes was so powerful and well-connected that he would find a way to silence her even if she reported him. She had thought about her options and decided the only way to stay safe was to disappear completely. She had withdrawn all the cash from her bank account at an ATM and then destroyed her credit cards and identification. She had taken a bus to Pennsylvania and had been living under a false name ever since. Every day, Sophie had lived in fear that Dr. Hayes would somehow track her down. She had nightmares about being dragged back to that basement. She had isolated herself from everyone she knew because she was afraid any contact might give away her location. It had been a lonely and terrifying 6 months, but she had survived. Lauren helped Sophie to her feet and told her she needed to come back to the city to give her testimony against Dr. Hayes. Sophie was hesitant, but Lauren promised that she would be protected. The detective explained that Sophie's testimony was crucial to making sure Dr. Hayes spent the rest of his life in prison. Sophie finally agreed and said she would do whatever was necessary to see justice done. Sophie Grant returned to the city with Lauren and Duke. The young woman was nervous during the entire drive and kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting Dr. Hayes to appear at any moment. Lauren kept reassuring her that she was safe but knew it would take time for Sophie to truly believe it. Trauma did not disappear overnight. It would take months or even years of healing before Sophie could feel secure again. When they arrived at the police station, Sophie was taken to a safe location where she could give her full statement. A victim advocate named Lisa Sanders was assigned to help Sophie through the process. Lisa was a kind woman with years of experience helping trauma victims navigate the legal system. She sat with Sophie during the interviews and made sure the young woman felt supported and understood. Sophie's testimony was detailed and damning. She described how Dr. Hayes had lured her to his townhouse under false pretenses. She explained how he had drugged her coffee and how she had woken up tied to a chair in the hidden basement. She talked about the 3 days of captivity, during which she had been kept sedated and terrified. She described the moment she had managed to pick the lock using a bent paperclip she had found on the floor. She told how she had crept up the stairs and escaped through the front door while Dr. Hayes slept. The investigators recorded everything and documented Sophie's injuries from the restraints that had bound her wrists. Though 6 months had passed, there were still faint scars that corroborated her story. Sophie's testimony, combined with the physical evidence from the hidden laboratory, created an overwhelming case against Dr. Hayes. The district attorney was confident they could secure a conviction on multiple charges, including kidnapping and drug trafficking and conspiracy. As the investigation continued, more victims came forward. Several of Dr. Hayes's former employees reported that they had suspected something was wrong but had been too afraid to speak up. A few patients admitted they had received medications from Dr. Hayes that were not properly documented. Some of these patients had become addicted to the prescription drugs he provided. Their lives had been damaged by his greed. The full scope of Dr. Hayes's criminal enterprise became clear. For 6 years, he had been operating a sophisticated drug trafficking operation while maintaining his public image as a respected surgeon and humanitarian. He had used his medical knowledge and his legitimate practice as a cover for illegal activities. The medications he diverted and synthesized had contributed to addiction and suffering throughout the city. Lives had been ruined by the drugs he sold for profit. Lauren worked closely with the district attorney's office to prepare the case for trial. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and analyzed. Every witness was interviewed and prepared to testify. The prosecution built a timeline showing exactly how Dr. Hayes had operated and how long the criminal activity had continued. They calculated the total value of the stolen and sold medications. They documented the harm caused to patients who became addicted. The case was solid and complete. Dr. Hayes's legal team tried multiple strategies to defend him. They argued that the evidence from the hidden room should be suppressed because the search was improper. But the judge ruled that the warrant had been valid and the search legal. They tried to claim that Dr. Hayes had been coerced into his confession. But the videotape of the interrogation showed he had been advised of his rights and had spoken voluntarily. They attempted to discredit Sophie's testimony by suggesting she was mentally unstable, but medical experts testified that her account was consistent with trauma from kidnapping. Eventually, it became clear that going to trial would result in conviction on all charges. Patricia Cole advised Dr. Hayes to consider a plea agreement. The district attorney offered a deal. If Dr. Hayes pleaded guilty to all charges and agreed to cooperate fully with identifying his drug trafficking network, he would receive 35 years in prison instead of life without parole. It was not a generous offer, but it was better than what he would face if convicted at trial. After days of discussion with his legal team, Dr. Hayes accepted the plea agreement. He stood in court and admitted his guilt to kidnapping Sophie Grant and to operating a drug trafficking operation for 6 years. He acknowledged that he had betrayed the trust of his patients and colleagues. He accepted responsibility for the harm he had caused. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 2 months later. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Sophie Grant sat in the front row with Lisa Sanders beside her. Lauren and Duke were there as well. Members of the media filled the gallery because the case had attracted significant attention. The fall of such a prominent and respected figure made headlines across the country. People wanted to see justice served. The judge allowed several victims to speak before imposing sentence. Sophie Grant stood at the podium and spoke directly to Dr. Hayes. Her voice was steady and strong. She said that he had stolen 6 months of her life and left her with trauma that would take years to heal. She said he had betrayed everything that being a doctor was supposed to mean, but she also said that she would not let him define her future. She was a survivor and she would rebuild her life. Other victims spoke about their struggles with addiction that stemmed from medications Dr. Hayes had provided. Family members talked about loved ones who had died from drug overdoses. The collective pain in that courtroom was palpable. Dr. Hayes sat with his head down throughout the victim statements. Whether he felt genuine remorse or simply regret at being caught was impossible to know. When it was time for the judge to speak, he did not mince words. He said that Dr. Hayes had committed some of the most egregious violations of trust he had seen in his years on the bench. He said that doctors were given special privileges and authority because society trusted them to use their knowledge for good. Dr. Hayes had perverted that trust and used his position to cause immense harm. The judge then imposed the agreed sentence of 35 years in federal prison. With Dr. Hayes' age, it was effectively a life sentence. As the bailiffs led Dr. Hayes away in handcuffs, Lauren felt a sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. The case that had begun with Duke's instincts at a townhouse door had ended with a major criminal behind bars. Sophie Grant was safe and could begin to heal. The city was safer with Dr. Hayes' drug operation shut down. Lauren reached down and scratched Duke behind the ears as they left the courtroom. The months following Dr. Hayes' sentencing brought significant changes for everyone involved in the case. Lauren Bishop was awarded a commendation for her investigative work and her determination to follow the evidence wherever it led. The police department held a ceremony honoring her contribution to solving such a complex case. But Lauren insisted that Duke deserved equal recognition. After all, the German Shepherd had been the one who first detected something wrong at the townhouse. Without Duke's instincts, the investigation might never have started. The department agreed, and Duke received his own commendation. A special collar was designed with a medal attached, recognizing him as a hero. The ceremony was covered by local news, and Duke became something of a celebrity. Children wanted to pet him when they saw him on patrol, and other officers treated him with even more respect than before. But Duke remained unchanged by the attention. He was still the same focused and dedicated working dog he had always been. Sophie Grant's recovery was slower and more difficult. The trauma of her kidnapping had left deep psychological scars that required professional help to heal. She worked with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, and gradually she began to feel safer. The nightmares decreased in frequency, and she stopped looking over her shoulder constantly. Lisa Sanders continued to check in on Sophie regularly and helped connect her with resources for housing and employment. After several months, Sophie made the decision to return to nursing. At first, the idea seemed impossible because the profession reminded her of Dr. Hayes and everything he had done. But Sophie realized that nursing was her calling, and she refused to let one evil man take that away from her. She found a position at a hospital in a different part of the city, far from where Dr. Hayes had practiced. Her new colleagues knew nothing of her ordeal, and Sophie preferred to keep it that way. She wanted to move forward without being defined by what had happened to her. Katie Sullivan, who had come forward with information about the medication discrepancies, also faced challenges. She felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, even though Lauren repeatedly told her that she was not responsible for Dr. Hayes' crimes. Katie eventually found peace by volunteering at a drug addiction recovery center. She wanted to help people overcome the kind of addiction that Dr. Hayes' illegal drugs had caused. It was her way of making something positive come from the terrible situation. The dismantling of Dr. Hayes' drug trafficking network continued long after his sentencing. The ledgers from his hidden laboratory contained names and contact information for dozens of buyers and distributors. Law enforcement agencies across the region used this information to make arrests and shut down operations. Some of the people arrested were themselves addicts who had been selling drugs to support their own habits. Others were career criminals who had been in the drug trade for years. Taking down Dr. Hayes' network had a measurable impact on drug availability in the city. The medical community also underwent some soul-searching after the case. How had Dr. Hayes been able to operate his illegal enterprise for 6 years without detection? Medical boards and regulatory agencies implemented new oversight procedures to monitor prescription drug orders more carefully. Hospitals and clinics created better systems for tracking controlled substances. The goal was to prevent another respected doctor from abusing their position in the same way. Dr. Hayes' charitable foundation was dissolved and its assets were liquidated. The money was used to compensate some of his victims and to fund drug addiction treatment programs. The irony was not lost on anyone that the foundation Dr. Hayes had used to build his public image as a humanitarian was now being used to help repair the damage he had caused. His name was removed from the medical research center that had been named in his honor. His published research papers came under scrutiny, and some were retracted when irregularities were discovered. His entire legacy was being systematically erased. Lauren continued her work as a detective with Duke always by her side. They solved many more cases together in the years that followed. Some were high-profile, like the Dr. Hayes case, while others were quiet victories that never made the news. But each case mattered because each one represented justice for someone who had been wronged. Lauren never forgot the lesson that the Dr. Hayes case had taught her. Trust your instincts and never underestimate what a good dog can tell you. Duke remained in service for 3 more years before age and arthritis forced him into retirement. On his last day of active duty, the entire police department gathered to honor him. There were speeches and awards and a banner that read, "Thank you for your service, Duke." Lauren stood beside her partner with tears in her eyes, knowing that their working relationship was ending. But Duke would live with her in retirement and they would still be together, even if they were no longer solving crimes. Sophie Grant attended Duke's retirement ceremony because she wanted to thank the dog who had helped save her life. She knelt down and hugged Duke and whispered her gratitude. Duke licked her face and wagged his tail. In his simple dog way, he seemed to understand that he had made a difference, that he had protected someone who needed protecting, that he had done his job well. Several years after Dr. Hayes' conviction, Lauren received a letter from Sophie. The young woman had gotten married and was expecting her first child. She had completed therapy and felt strong and whole again. She wrote that she wanted Lauren and Duke to know that they had given her the chance to reclaim her life. Without their dedication and persistence, Sophie might have spent the rest of her years hiding and afraid. Instead, she was building a future filled with hope and happiness. Lauren read the letter to Duke, who was now retired and spending his days sleeping in sunny spots around her house. The old dog lifted his head and looked at Lauren with those same intelligent brown eyes that had seen so much. Lauren told him that they had done good work together, that they had made a real difference in people's lives. Duke's tail thumped once against the floor as if he understood and agreed. The case of Dr. Vincent Hayes became part of police training programs as an example of how important it is to follow all leads no matter how unlikely they seem. It demonstrated the value of canine units and the instincts that trained dogs bring to investigations. It showed that criminal behavior can hide behind any facade and that thorough police work can expose even the most carefully concealed crimes. For Lauren, the case remained one of the most important of her career, not because of the publicity or the commendations, but because of what it represented. It showed that persistence pays off and that trusting your partner, whether human or canine, can lead to justice. Most importantly, it proved that evil may hide for a time, but eventually truth and determination will bring it into the light, where it can be defeated. Dr. Vincent Hayes stood at the pinnacle of his profession, and everyone in the city knew his name. At 42 years old, he had built a reputation as one of the most brilliant cardiovascular surgeons in the country. His private practice in Manhattan catered to celebrities and politicians and wealthy business magnates who trusted him with their lives. Awards lined his office walls and medical journals regularly published his groundbreaking research. The media loved him, and he appeared on morning talk shows discussing health and wellness with his charming smile that made everyone feel safe. His charitable foundation provided free heart surgeries to underprivileged children, and the newspapers called him a humanitarian. He lived in a luxurious Upper East Side townhouse that spoke of his success, and his life seemed absolutely perfect from every angle. Detective Lauren Bishop had heard of Dr. Hayes long before she ever met him because everyone had. His face was on billboards and his name was mentioned in conversations about excellence in medicine. But Lauren was not thinking about any of that as she stood outside the doctor's townhouse on a cold October morning. She was there because of a missing person case that had gone cold 6 months ago. A young nurse named Sophie Grant had vanished without a trace, and the only connection anyone could find was that she had briefly worked at Dr. Hayes' clinic before her disappearance. The case had haunted Lauren for months because Sophie had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle, and her bank accounts remained untouched, and her family had heard nothing from her. It was as if she had never existed. Beside Lauren sat her partner Duke, who was not human but a German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. The dog had been with her for 3 years, and in that time they had cracked dozens of cases together. Duke was not just any police dog because he had an uncanny ability to detect things other dogs missed. He had a sixth sense that had earned him commendations from the department and respect from every officer who worked with him. Lauren had learned to trust Duke's instincts completely because the dog had never been wrong. When Duke sensed something, it meant there was something to find. As they approached the pristine white steps of the townhouse, Duke suddenly stopped. His ears perked forward and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Lauren felt her pulse quicken because she knew what that meant. Duke had detected something, and his body language told her it was important. The dog's nose twitched as he sniffed the air, and then the ground, and then the ornate iron railing leading up to the front door. Something had caught his attention, and it was something invisible to human senses. Lauren knelt beside her partner and whispered softly, asking him what he had found, but Duke just continued to sniff and growl low in his throat. The morning air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across the sidewalk as Lauren studied the townhouse. Everything about it screamed wealth and perfection. The windows gleamed, and the facade was immaculate, and even the small garden area was perfectly manicured. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Duke was telling her otherwise. She had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving, and that evil often wore the mask of respectability. Duke did not care about appearances because his nose told him the truth that human eyes could not see. Lauren took a deep breath and walked up the steps with Duke close at her heels. She pressed the doorbell and heard its melodious chime echo inside the house. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open. Dr. Vincent Hayes stood there wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and designer jeans. He looked more like a movie star than a surgeon on his day off. His smile was warm and welcoming, and his blue eyes sparkled with apparent friendliness. Everything about him projected confidence and charm. He greeted Lauren warmly and said he had been expecting her. He mentioned Sophie's name with what seemed like genuine sadness and invited Lauren and Duke inside. The detective studied his face carefully as she entered because she had interviewed enough criminals to know that some people were very good at lying. The townhouse interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Modern art hung on the walls, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a design magazine. Everything was perfect and pristine and organized. Too perfect, Lauren thought to herself. They walked through the foyer into a spacious living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the morning light. Dr. Hayes offered coffee or tea, but Lauren declined politely. She wanted to keep this professional and focused. As they settled into the seating area, Duke refused to sit. The dog remained standing, and his attention was fixed on a hallway that led toward the back of the house. His nostrils flared repeatedly, and Lauren could see that he was processing scents that told him a story she could not yet read. Dr. Hayes noticed Duke's behavior and commented on what a beautiful dog he was. Lauren thanked him and explained that Duke was her partner and the best detective in the department. The doctor's smile seemed to tighten just slightly, and Lauren caught it. It was just a fraction of a second, but she had been trained to notice these things. She filed the observation away in her mind. For the next 20 minutes, Lauren asked standard questions about Sophie Grant's employment at the clinic. She asked about Sophie's duties and whether Dr. Hayes had noticed anything unusual about her behavior before she disappeared. His answers were polite and helpful and completely unrevealing. He expressed appropriate concern and sadness about the missing woman. He said Sophie had been a good nurse and that her disappearance was tragic. He claimed to have told the previous investigators everything he knew, and that he wished he could be more helpful. But Duke never relaxed during the entire conversation. The dog's focus remained locked on that hallway, and twice he whined softly. Lauren knew that sound well because it meant Duke wanted to investigate something. She could see the tension in his body and the way his eyes kept darting toward the back of the house. Whatever Duke was sensing, it was strong enough to hold his complete attention. Lauren decided to test something, and she asked Dr. Hayes if Duke could take a walk around the house. She explained that sometimes the dog picked up scents that helped eliminate possibilities in investigations. The doctor paused, and the pause lasted only a fraction of a second, but Lauren caught it. He then explained that he was allergic to pet dander and had taken medication that day. Because he knew she was bringing Duke, he said if the dog went through the whole house, he would be sneezing for days. It was a reasonable excuse, and Lauren had no grounds to push further. But Duke's behavior told her everything she needed to know, and something was wrong in this house.